It's been quite a long time since I've got a chance to practice Polish consistently, and I'm not going to subject you to my grammar or accent. Okay, so unfortunately, I'm actually not going to talk too much about borders today, which is predominantly what I work on. Instead, I'm going to talk to you about a very specific ethnographic moment from my fieldwork. And we all have that one element of our research that remains kind of stubbornly fascinating, but also incredibly difficult to connect to the rest of our ethnography. And so this paper is about that one moment for me. On the face of it, this is a paper about miracles, but more specifically, this is a paper about transformation. Today I'm going to argue that anthropology has tended to approach miracles from the perspective of the question of belief, foregrounding the inner worlds of our participants, but not the miraculous objects themselves. With that in mind, today I'm going to focus on the material qualities of the miracle and ask what type of an object a miracle might be and how this might change our understanding of why they are efficacious, even as believers admit that they don't completely believe in them. So I'm dealing with one very specifically odd miracle that I came across from the Eastern Orthodox Christian community. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is that the people I'm talking about aren't completely convinced of this miracle, yet they are convinced that it does things in the area. And I think that's a really interesting perspective to come from. So today's paper is going to talk a little bit about the anthropology of miracles, but more about kind of material culture in anthropology, and also the anthropology of images and art a little bit too. So it might be a little bit strange, but hopefully it'll be somewhat enjoyable. I'm going to read from this if you don't mind, so I apologise for being a little bit less engaging than normally, but hopefully I'll be able to look up and show you some various different photos and explain them to you throughout. Apologies as well for my Irish accent and the speed at which I talk. It is a cultural legacy I cannot get rid of.
We did the recording just in case.
Perfect. You can play it back at half pace and you might be able to follow. Okay, so in early October 2011, there was a mass held to celebrate the independently, scientifically verified miracle object from the Roman Catholic Church of St. Anthony in Sokołka. The miracle in question occurred when a fragment of the communion wafer was dropped and spontaneously transformed into the heart tissue of supposedly human heart tissue in 2008. This was a transformation that was verified through histopathological testing in 2009 and returned to the church in 2011 to much celebration at the beginning of my fieldwork. Later, in November of the same year, a story began to circulate about the astonishing emergency landing of Polish Airlines Flight 16 in Warsaw after the complete failure of its landing gear. Local tabloids in my research field and my interlocutors in the town of Koden in northeastern Poland insinuated that this miracle was due in equal parts to the skill of the pilot and to the vial of Pope John Paul II's blood that one passenger was carrying with them. To the people I worked with, these stories acted as verification that the age of miracles was not done, and that their own belief in the power of holy images wasn't naive. Koden had its own miracle object. I'm not sure if you can see these photos very clearly, but if it was a little bit darker, you'd see just how gold they all are, which is an important fact I'm going to come back to later. It was a Roman Catholic image of the Mother of God, and although she wasn't as active as she had once been, the votives and gifts in her sanctuary and the continuous stream of pilgrims that arrived in the town attested to her power and past potency. She also formed part of a landscape of miracle-working images of the Mother of God, which ran along the eastern border of Poland. Most of the image has ceased to be ostentiously efficacious in the late 1800s, but they still drew pilgrims and, importantly, sacralized the landscape with their power. In this paper, I'm interested in one particular contested miraculous image, and this is it. Here we go. This object was not located in Koden, but in a town further north, Teraspol. This miraculous object was in the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church and was an image of Panagia Grigoripikos, which is the Greek image of Our Lady of Quickly Answered Prayers. It had begun to weep oily tears 2 years before the start of my fieldwork. The image itself is actually an inexpensive reproduction of the original Greek icon, printed on pulpit cardboard. It was brought at a temporary market stall set up at a pilgrimage site in Ukraine. and the icon was housed now in the large Eastern Orthodox Christian church. So today I'm going to present a specific ethnographic account of one specific celebration from this church in Tiraspol. What I'm arguing for is an approach to miracle that foregrounds materiality, setting aside a focus on belief. The question of belief has locked the study of miracles into the anthropology of religion. And in embracing art and material culture, this paper demonstrates that there's a way of analysing miracles that takes seriously what they do and how people engage in them beyond the question of faith. To do this, within the existing literature, I'm going to give you engage with the existing literature on miracles, images and anthropology, and then draw out a method of analysis that incorporates ideas from anthropology and art and material cultures. Recent anthropological work on images has emphasised that their ability to work on the world rests on their dynamic nature. Images happen through mediation, through the relationship between body and medium, or idea and object. They are made present. In this paper, I want to directly address that idea of presence and transformation, grounding what has often been an abstract discussion of that relies on ephemeral questions about what images might want, to paraphrase Mitchell. Through a detailed look at the life of this particular icon, I'm going to argue that images are not simply objects to look through, but ambiguous, dense, material presences. Okay, so I'm going to tell you the story of this image to begin with. Early in December 2011, my landlady invited me to accompany her family to see the miraculous weeping image of the Mother of God in Tiraspol. During the drive, as I sat freezing and crushed against the window of an overly packed car, my landlady's son-in-law and her grandson explained the basic story of the icon to me. A year previously, a local grandmother from Tiraspol had brought a reproduction of the Greek icon Panagia Gorgokos from Ukraine while on pilgrimage there. The woman brought the icon home and set it up in her living room alongside several other reproductions. One day, her 14-year-old grandson, Łukasz, was praying to the icon very strongly when it suddenly started to weep oil. Łukasz was known locally to be a very devout young man with a vocation for the priesthood, and it appears that his proximity was central to the icon's tears. At first, the family kept the icon at home, where it continued to weep and attract a large number of visitors. But soon the weeping icon the story had spread so far and its fame had grown to such an extent that the house was constantly beset by pilgrims from all over eastern Poland. It became impossible to live with the icon, and the family eventually offered her to the local church. The icon has been in the church for over a year by the time of my fieldwork in 2011-2012, and when she first arrived, she'd stopped crying. During 2009, the icon wept, however, on 3 separate occasions, but there was apparently no reason for why she might be crying. My friends in the Eastern Orthodox community, however, thought that the icon had initially stopped crying because she was removed and wrenched from her home, and they speculated that the parish priest's decision to make Łukasz an altar boy had encouraged the icon to produce tears again. And I'm consistently using the word her here because this is how the people I knew referred to this icon. They didn't refer to it as ikona or obraz, it was her, she. It's a very kind of personal relationship that they had with it. Since the icon had been moved to the church, the crying had been witnessed by a local Eastern Orthodox bishop, which had increased its recognition as a miracle. A small cottage industry had grown up around the icon. Her tears are gathered and the oil was used in services in the church and offered as a gift to pilgrims. Photographs have been collected, and while stored in an album at the time of my fieldwork, the priest told me he intended to make them into a book. Unfortunately, I haven't found that book yet either. It is almost as delayed as my own. I visited the weeping icon of the Mother of God during the Nativity Fast, during which time there was a specially organised celebration of the miraculous object. Alongside participants from the local area, there was a bus full of pilgrims from Białystok and a film crew present for the service, filming it for a local TV station. The liturgy lasted about an hour, and there was an extra 20 minutes at the end for a service dedicated to the icon. So the church itself is large and square, and this is just a photograph from the end of the service where people are going up to kind of collect these oily rags that have the tears pressed on them. And the local priest had estimated that at the height of this particular service, there was over 150 congregants. The cold had begun to really bite by this time of the year, and yet the church was stuffy and warm. The multicoloured stone tiles were covered by kind of an assortment of Persian-style rugs, but the walls were cold, painted white, obscured occasionally through decorative frescoes from the Bible. The ceilings were painted to represent the dome of heaven, but the steam rising from the clothes of the pilgrims obscured this completely. Although the pilgrims were crammed into the single room, there was also three other, you can kind of see them here, three other analogians or kind of tables with icons on them, and another two freestanding icons. And these were the much more traditional hand-painted wooden icons. And they look quite strikingly different when you see them up close. And as the congregation entered throughout the Mass, they brought candles from a makeshift shop at the back of the store to place on these stands. And although the action required a lot of moving and place swapping, it didn't appear to cause great interruption. The weeping icon was placed on the left-hand side and was, at first glance, like any other mass reproduced icon available at festivals, ones that you can buy in Christian stores or online. It was A3 in size, colour printed on stiff cardboard with gold foil accents. But up close you could trace the track of oily residue running down from the face and onto the clothing. The tears the icon cried were fragrant oil and not salt water, and this was incredibly important to the Orthodox pilgrims. They connected this oil with myrrh, the oil given to Jesus at his birth and at his death. And before the service and after, people made their way to the weeping icon throughout, kissing the glass encasing the image, lighting a candle and offering a prayer. Some pilgrims even brought photographs of loved ones, miniature icons of strings or rosary beads, which they would press urgently to the glass case. During the church service, I was sent to the frozen choir balcony by the parish priest so I could get a proper view of the service, and Łukasz, whose prayers had initially begun the weeping of the icon, had volunteered to stand with me and explain what was going on. I was introduced to him properly after Mass, as he had stayed to clean the weeping icon. 16-year-old Łukasz was devout and enthusiastic about his faith. During our conversation, he spoke softly, slowly, and certainly. We spoke while he cleaned, and in his interview, Łukasz only briefly addressed the story of the icon. Instead, he wanted to speak more briefly about icons in Eastern Poland. He emphasised the unifying capacity of icons based on their shared importance for Eastern Orthodox and non-Orthodox Christians alike. This echoed an argument that I'd already heard several times from different members of the Eastern Orthodox clergy. He also took time to describe to me how in this region of Poland, the Mother of God was very important and very active. Our conversation ended when he finished cleaning and a monk came to open the glass case, then close the weeping icon so that Łukasz could dust the inside of the glass and kiss the image. Like the congregants who had earlier crowded around the glass-covered object, the altar boy and the priest both kissed it gently, like one would the head of a small child. The whole service had been highly charged and really quite moving. But in this moment, the visceral, affective connection between the image and these men was particularly striking. And the effective pull of the image has stayed with me far beyond my time in the field. And I think this was the moment when I decided that this was a very strange and important kind of piece of ethnographic work. It was just such a powerfully emotional moment for these two particular men. Most of the people I spoke with that day in Tiraspol drew this kind of direct link between their miraculous icon and the image in Kłodzeń, and the better-known carving of Our Lady at Leszna Podlaska, both examples of Roman Catholic images. Łukasz was right. There was a religious landscape in this part of Poland, and it was one dominated by the Mother of God. The idea that the Mother of God is an active participant in the production of space is reflected in the stories of how images and statues of the Mother of God were pulled to Eastern Poland or manifested miraculously in its rivers and fields and even wells. Even the titles given to these Marian objects reflected their connection to local affairs. They're often identified simply as the Blessed Mother of a given town, or presenting a kind of kinship relation between the towns and the divine presence of the Mother of God. Kłodzeni's holy image, for example, has many titles, and among the more usual Blessed Mother of Kłodzeń, she's also known as by the honorific Queen of Podlaski. The potency of this title is made clear in a book about the churches and monasteries in Eastern Poland, written by a local politician. It's particularly grandly titled Axis Mundi, the axis of the world, referring to this part of Poland. In one section he declares, and this is a quote from the book, badly translated, "Regardless of what you think about Kaczynski or Tusk, it doesn't matter. There are no democratic elections in South Podlaski. It makes no sense. Simply because we are a monarchy, the Queen lives in Kłodzeń." So this isn't just something that local people are saying, this is something that politicians are manifesting to kind of make specific claims about the area. The miraculous images of the Mother of God sacralize the landscape, but it's also important to note that all these objects were Roman Catholic. For Smallco, the author of this book then, the presence of the holy image of the Mother of God in Culloden legitimates the Roman Catholic claim to ownership of the land and heritage of the town. This is despite the fact there's a contesting Eastern Orthodox claim to these two things as well. Other nearby portraits of the Mother of God perform similar functions, but what is striking is that there's no Eastern Orthodox Christian icons of the Mother of God with the same power. In this case, the Tiraspol Weeping Mother of God has a potentially political role. Allowing Tiraspol's weeping icon to become part of this local landscape of Mariology gives the Eastern Orthodox Christian population a place in producing the religious landscape of Eastern Poland, challenging the Roman Catholic hegemony. In the borders of northeastern Poland, Eastern Orthodox Christians are a religious minority found in most large towns. And what really surprised me most when I started working in this area was how many of my Polish friends and colleagues initially told me I was just wrong about this. But they are, in most of the large towns, specifically in the kind of northeastern area, you'll find large, relatively large congregations. While Poland is often, outside of Poland, being spoken of as homogeneously Roman Catholic, anthropologists working along the country's borders, including Agnieszka Pasierka, Jura Buzalka, Michał Głuchowski, and Chris Hahn, have always challenged this assumption. The northeastern borders of Poland have a long history of religious and ethnic heterogeneity, and the Eastern Orthodox Christians form one of the largest minority groups. And while most towns would have a relatively small population, the community frequently comes together in large numbers for religious or cultural celebrations, congregating in towns and villages that hold historic religious significance. Tiraspol has a particularly large number of Eastern Orthodox Christian families, and since the arrival of the miraculous icon, the church has kind of welcomed an expanded number of congregants coming from a whole load of different villages, and it's become a really important part of the local Eastern Orthodox Christian landscape. During my fieldwork, I found that the Eastern Orthodox Christians I encountered were particularly enthusiastic to be involved in my research. Over the course of the year, I was constantly invited to attend Eastern Orthodox Christian festivals and events, and while there, quite regularly honoured with a seat at the priest's table, which was mildly disconcerting. During these festivals and feasts, people were always eager to explain to me the complicated relationship between Eastern Orthodox Christians and Roman Catholics, and wanted to interrogate the complex relationship between their religious identity and the assumption that this corresponded to Ukrainian ethnic identity. The priests, monks, and lay activists I spoke with were outspoken about the way that Eastern Orthodox Christians were either ignored or alienated in discussions of Polish identity. The group's awareness of their status as outsiders fed into the practice of frequently travelling to different locations for festivals, to congregate as a diocese rather than as a number of smaller parishes. At these festivals, the numbers of participants was always in the hundreds, making visible, audible, and olfactory impact on the towns they gathered in. And in these instances, the community leaders always drew a clear connection between the Eastern Orthodox Christian population and the land, emphasising the relationship between the religion and the region was long-standing and meaningful. And I think this is why this idea of this icon becoming empowered when it lands in this particular part of Poland is so important, and why these stories of icons coming out of the land are so important, because they speak to that very meaningful physical connection to the land that these religious communities claim. So the political potentials of the miraculous or holy images might help clarify why most of the Roman Catholics, and in fact many of the Eastern Orthodox Christians to whom I spoke, were very careful when it came to speaking about the truth of this miracle in Tiraspol. Many of them kind of questioned the veracity of the weeping icon of the Mother of God, and this kind of fell into two particular camps. The first group expressed their doubts and skepticism around the materiality of the image, and the second group advanced a criticism of crying as a miracle. For the first group, the idea that a commercially produced and purchased icon could be miraculous was laughable. They pointed out that the icon had no history and that it looked out of place in the church beside all the wooden icons. They were implicitly delineating the kinds of materials that were acceptable mediators of divine presence and clarifying which materials were definitely not. Brigitte Meyer has pointed out that the religious experience can be shaped by encounters with specific sensorial forms, that these are matters, acts, imaginations, and bodily sensations that shape religious mediation. Matter alone, in other words, has no intrinsic power, but they do have specific affordances that are authorized and authenticated with reference to established regimes, aesthetic regimes. So in other words, the reason that some of my people I spoke with could not believe the miraculous of the weeping icon was because for them the materiality of the image was far too mundane and failed to fit into the accepted range of aesthetic forms which they habitually perceived as transparent mediums capable of facilitating divine presence. And I think that's quite a complicated and complex critique of this particular miracle. And I want to point out one that a lot of the people who ostentatiously believed in the miracle often talked about as well. The other group of skeptics focused their disagreements on a more theological point and argued that tears were not a real miracle. In this argument, the tears were presented as a cheap trick, and miracles were equated with healing and protection, in other words, Coden and Czestochowa. There was an assumption that there was agreed upon miraculous form across the various different Christian faiths. The Eastern Orthodox Christians who believed in the power of the weeping icon were therefore presented as naive believers, as earnest but theologically unsophisticated. This was not what I found, however, when I began to ask people to explain how they understood the miracle. Instead, I found that the people who gathered around the weeping icon of the Mother of God that day had a complex, contradictory, and critically engaged understanding of what a miracle is. And in fact, I would argue potentially a little bit more of a complex one than maybe anthropologists have had previously. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. The section that I'm going to talk about now is quite long and has a lot of references and ideas in it. So I apologize for that, and I might skip over some of them because I'm aware of the time as well. But what I'm going to try and do is essentially draw out a history of how we've approached miracles in anthropology, and then using the kind of anthropology that's going on currently with images and photography and art to challenge some of those assumptions by thinking specifically about the materiality of miracles. So the idea that the Eastern Orthodox Christian churches practice a more mystical Christian faith than Roman Catholic or Protestant churches is an old and pernicious one. And I do not intend to replicate this assumption by my focus on this particular miracle. Instead, I suggest that we cannot take for granted that what this miracle, and miracles more generally do, is wholly mystical. To do so represents a failure to engage with the mechanics of miraculous objects and their relationships to the world around them, in favour of concentrating on the question of truth or belief. Writing in 2015, this, by the way, is just a very close-up image of the miracle, so you can see her oily tears. Writing in 2015, Pelkmans noted that anthropologists are often anxious to avoid addressing the question of miraculous truth, and yet it seems to hover at the edges of all anthropological encounters with miraculous objects. In other words, he's saying, we will never come out and say whether or not we believe in a miracle. We study them, but we kind of dance around the question of whether or not we think people are right. And yet that question kind of remains at the edges of everything that we do. So it's always there, even if we're trying to avoid it. While anthropologists such as De Veers have argued that the efficacy or proof of miracles doesn't actually matter analytically, they remained fascinated with the question of why and how people believe miracles. Whether the focus was on the effect, or how people distinguish between true and false, or the rationale for miraculous thought, time and time again, the question underneath is about the nature of belief. So in other words, the miracle just becomes a kind of plastered on idea to this kind of anthropological fascination with belief that occupies the anthropology of religion a little bit excessively. What ties the study of miracles to the study of inner states, but more, about the nature of belief. This ties the study of miracles to the study of inner states, but more importantly, focuses on the actions and opinions of the devotee, leaving aside the affordances and acts of the objects. While not attending to the truth of the miracles in question, Pelkmans continues his chapter by proceeding to study how miraculous truth is produced in the Pentecostal churches of Kazakhstan. Placing the beliefs of the individuals he discusses at the centre of his work, he focuses on the temporary and unsettled nature of the newfound religious conviction he observes, and demonstrates that miraculous truth is unstable and has a capacity to decay over time. Pelkmans spends time exploring what counts as a miracle and how miracles are tested or incorporated into stories of conviction. But the question of what the miracle objects actually do to the world around them is addressed as a secondary concern. And there's just a deep irony in Pelkman's chapter, because he does such a good job of identifying the limits of the studies and then kind of replicates some of that himself towards the end. Similarly, Webb Keene's Rotting Bodies treats miraculous affordances seriously, but leaves them aside to delve into the nature of miraculous truth. I don't know, has Webb Keene become a central figure in Polish anthropology yet, but in anthropology in the UK, he has come to dominate the field of the anthropology of religion, so you kind of can't write about it without addressing him. I apologise in advance. So I'm going to skip up there. What Keene is, he was actually working on the conflict over the truth of the uncorrupted bodies of Eastern Orthodox Christian saints during communism. And he argued that they reflected divergent ontological assumptions about the nature of ethics. He said, for the miracle believer, the material world is ethically saturated. There are no accidents or neutral causalities. And there's always signs and agents, and they're multiple and all subject to ethical evaluation. The question of whether they're true or not. However, and he kind of contrasts what local believers of these uncorrupted bodies of saints are talking about with the beliefs of the communist commissars and the Orthodox clergy. And he argues that for both the commissar and the priest, the realm of the miracle must lay beyond the ordinary world. Which is part of politics, or instead it becomes part of the transcendental realm of morality and theology. Keene is arguing, basically, that peasants were not naive believers. Rather, they were attempting to deal with lofty theological claims in a concrete manner, reflecting the semiotic ideologies that they had developed through their own engagement with religion. In this approach, the effort or the effect of miracle objects depends wholly on belief and internal conceptual structures. While these conceptual structures might have been shaped by the material world is secondary to the decision of whether or not a miracle is true. So Keene spends very little time exploring how the bodies of the saints elicited such fervent belief, how they shaped and acted on the peasants and on their worlds. And this is just constantly replicated in the work on miracles. People talk about objects in a very passing way. They don't really engage in what the objects are or what they're doing. In what follows, I've established the value of shifting the anthropological perspective away from inner states towards materiality, from the question of belief to the question of what do miracles do. As I will demonstrate in the ethnographic section that's going to follow, thinking about material affordances yields a better analysis of the multiple scales on which the icon's transformations are active. The tears that flow down the image of the Mother of God are experienced up close and in a distinctly personal encounter. Yet these tears are also essential to the icon's role in establishing an Eastern Orthodox Christian claim on the local Marianological landscape, and intervening with debates about belonging along the Polish frontier. The pilgrims who flocked to the weeping icon weren't just passive recipients of wonder. The pilgrims and Eastern Orthodox Christians were in constant debate about the miracle, how it should be understood, and what it might be working to transform in their world. Very few admitted to believing completely in the miracle. The icon had a dynamic and unsettled life. And when we follow the transformations, what becomes clear is that the materiality of images are just as important for understanding their social lives as meaning is. It's not just about how the individual pilgrims orientated themselves to the image, but also a question of how images orientated themselves to the rest of the world. And I'm going to talk about someone who I do think has done a really good job of thinking about the materiality of a miracle and how that affects it. An article by Kuyada on Etigolov, a Buryat Buddhist monk. He was an imperishable body who was buried and 8 years later dug up and subjected to scientific analysis. And what came back was that his body, when analysed, it was as though it was only 12 hours and not 8 years dead. So the actual matter of his body, when subjected to various different tests, wasn't exactly what it should have been. So what Kuyada demonstrates is how this miracle helped Buddhist monks, lay worshippers, and the general public in the Buryat Republic talk about and reconsider the science-religious dichotomy in the wake of the disintegration of the USSR. She starts by examining the scientific analysis that verified that Etigilov was not dead in the same way that other mummified frozen bodies are. Here, the scientific verification didn't actually resolve the truth of the miracle. In fact, it was precisely the scientific proof that produced uncertainty. Some began to question if Etigilov was actually dead, or was he perhaps undead or alive in some form of deep tantric meditation. Etigilov was religiously and scientifically more complex than he first appeared, but rather than reducing his power, so you would think this might prove he isn't real or he's uncertainly real, instead of reducing his power, this uncertainty created a space for his transformative potential. It gave him a unique in-between status that contextualized him as part of a new and ongoing dialogic relationship between science and religion, enabling his incorrupt body to reconcile two competing systems of knowledge. Etigilov materially lives in both worlds, in the scientific and the religious world, and any discussion of the miracle brings these two worlds into conversation with one another. In this way, his uncertain death, life, or perhaps undeath, I think was what Kyadov describes it as, critically engages with legacies of Soviet science and the intricacies of post-Soviet religious landscape in the Buryat Republic. Kyadov's conclusion is, in part, possible because she doesn't distinguish between one understanding of Etigilov as belief and another understanding as knowledge. She looks beyond his apparent transformative potential, the ability to defy decay, to identify other ways that the miracle of Etigilov has transformed people's experience of the world. What Kyadov addresses is that the transformation of Etigilov and the transformations he's enabled. She avoids one of the pitfalls of the focus on belief, that of assuming belief is a form of knowledge separate from other ways of knowing, that it's somehow uninvestigated or uncritically engaged with. In doing this, she approaches the theology of Buddhist miracles as indivisible from the politics of post-Soviet change. And Meta Hai has considered this particular approach as what she calls a cosmopolitics. It's a cosmology that doesn't presuppose politics to be secular or theology to be separate from politics. So I want to end this section with a brief account of the Eastern Orthodox theology of miracles, very, very brief. But I want to emphasize that this theology is negotiated through practice. And in Teraspol and Eastern Poland, this practice is politically engaged with the question of belonging and entangled with the everyday border work that constitutes local negotiations of state space. In other words, much like what Kyadov is saying, when we set aside the question of belief, we can talk about all these various different critical engagements that people have with miracles as ways of knowing. And when we think about them as ways of knowing, we stop separating out the practice that's going on in the church from the politics of belonging that's going on in other spaces where Eastern Orthodox Christians are engaging perhaps more apparently politically. So unlike Roman Catholicism, the recognition of miracles in Eastern Orthodox Christianity is not a centralized or formalized procedure. Although there are a number of guidelines for how miracle working icons should be managed, miracles are merely events that are either wondrous signs or cause wonder. While all miracles attest to the divine providence of God's active presence in the world, they do not need to be large, extravagant, or go against the natural order, which is one thing that Roman Catholic miracles need to do, is go against the natural order. In fact, according to the 20th century theologian Bulgakov, miracles cannot go against the natural order, as the world is a dynamic organism, and all that is spiritual is material. Bulgakov's work on miracles attests that taking the incarnation and resurrection of Christ seriously means acknowledging that God is always immanent in the world, and the world, therefore, the natural realm, always possesses the capacity to literally transform into the body of Christ. So this is quite an extreme position in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and I've definitely had discussions with different priests and bishops and monks who disagreed or strongly agreed with this. But essentially what it is to say is that miracles don't need to go against the natural order, that there's something seen as miracles being inherently natural rather than unnatural. What this suggests is that miracles are not about weeping or healing, but about the material object's ability to constantly transform, and about the material world's ability to constantly transform and manifest the presence of divinity. So in this final section of the paper, and I'm drawing to a close on all this excessive discussion of various different names and dates, I'm going to talk about the weeping icon of the Virgin Mary in Pedestal, particularly through how it's transforming constantly. So to finish, thinking a little bit about what images are, Hans Belting has suggested that icons and images more generally are only experienced through mediation. He's trying to think beyond the seemingly intractable opposition between idea and object. And in doing so, he says we need to begin by accepting that images have a double nature. This is because images span the boundary between physical and mental existence. They're in a state of perpetual transformation across this boundary. Anthropologist Roger Sansi calls this a dynamic understanding of the image as something that happens through a relationship. In this way, an image can endure even as it moves across different media. Unlike Benjamin's portrait or Gell's art object, the reproduction of miraculous objects doesn't disenchant the original. Instead, the ability of a miraculous image to move through different media is part of its power and essential to its ability to evoke wonder. Instead of thinking of the miraculous image as an object of belief or a portrait with manifest divinity, we can think of the image as an event. The miraculous image is only present in specific relationships of medium and presence at a specific moment. So I'm going to return to Tedespool and back to the kind of nice ethnography sessions to focus on specific moments where the image has moved through various different material forms and specific locations, and draw attention to how this image was transformed in these encounters while also transforming the world around her. I do think that this section makes clear what I'm trying to say here, but I'm going to come back to it in the conclusion anyway, because I'm aware that it's a slightly complex Hans Belting is very complex and never says anything in a straightforward manner, and I blame the translation of German into English, but perhaps he's just speaking a little bit complicatedly. But I think that actually what's really interesting about this miracle is it takes something that he's saying quite in the abstract and makes it very concrete and much more easy to understand what's going on, and I think explains to us why it's important to think about this. So materiality is at the heart of Tedespool's miracle. The most unusual aspect of the Weeping Mother of God icon was the medium through which the image appeared. Cardboard icons are widely distributed across this area of Poland. Bought at festivals and pilgrimage sites as gifts or souvenirs, they fill the homes of Orthodox and Roman Catholic populations alike. And I'd actually been making a study of these domestic icons when I was introduced to this particular miracle. Most of the Eastern Orthodox Christians I spoke to were well versed in the theology of these icons, and particularly the distinction between veneration and worship. I was consistently reminded of that. And they remained unconvinced that their own icons were actually sites of divine presence. The materials were just too ordinary. The Eastern Orthodox Christians I spoke with believed that the manifestation of divine presence required an icon to be a work of technological enchantment, the combined efforts of the embodied skills of the artist and the immanence of the divine within and the material. Yet no one questioned the presence of the divinity in the weeping icon of Tedespool. In fact, ironically, the matter of the image, the very ordinary cardboard and foil print, seemed instead to be vital to her miraculousness. Pilgrims frequently mentioned that they had the same icons in their homes, attesting to the icon's popularity and mundanity. Others spoke more directly of the ordinariness, obliquely referencing its construction. On the way to church, my landlady and her son-in-law, Basil, were at pains to explain to me how the nature of the cardboard icon made the tears even more miraculous. Basil was a former construction worker, and he explained that some materials can weep naturally. Seemingly desiccated timber can store up congealed sap for many years before the right conditions decollage it, and it leaks through the fibrous wood. Similarly, concrete and stone, he explained, are both porous materials, inclined to let moisture seep from within. However, he concluded, this icon is made from a type of cardboard that is pulped during its production, wringing out any water or oil that might be present. My landlady concurred and further offered that the water and oil both degrade cardboard, and yet the icon remains miraculously intact. Later, during a conversation about the icon, the parish priest repeated this technical explanation for the scientific veracity of the miracle. He also added to it, detailing the sensory and affective importance of oily tears. Sin is, he told me, according to the Bible, a foul odour unto God, whereas myrrh is, and this is from apparently 2 Corinthians, a sweet savour of Christ unto God. It's a smell that gushed and flowed and seeped from the saints. And in fact, one of the things about uncorrupted saints' bodies is they still smell beautifully, apparently. For the priest of the church, the oil didn't need to heal or perform any other miracles. The aroma of the oil was the aroma of forgiveness and release from sin, which overcame the pilgrims in the presence of the icon. This scent can absolve sin, as it does the grace of God, and is a clear example of how the bodies of the pilgrims become entangled with the production of the miracle. Many pilgrims had intense responses to the icon, shaking, weeping, experienced a deep sense of peace. Up close, they could see the ordinariness of the icon's construction and the traces of oily tears, which incredibly left the cheap cardboard intact. The vicinity of this remnant of the original miracle elicited a sense of wonder at the transformation of such an ordinary object. The responses of the pilgrims to this sense of wonder created a new miraculous event. Through the interactions between the material presence of the miracle and the weeping bodies of the pilgrims, the miraculous icon was transforming the world around her. The ordinariness of the icon was both starkly highlighted and circumscribed by her location in the church. On the one hand, juxtaposed to the traditional icons, it was impossible not to notice her slightly shoddy quality. On the other hand, the church offered an institutional weight to the image. It had also begun to decorate her like any other traditional icon, encased in glass, surrounded by votives, pulling the image into the aesthetic regime of the church. Being in the church also positioned the miraculous image centrally in wider debates about Eastern Orthodox Christianity in Eastern Poland. When I first arrived in Tiraspol, I was told that the Church of St. John the Apostle was one of the oldest Eastern Orthodox churches in Eastern Poland. However, I later found out that the origin of the church is much less certain, and in fact it was originally an Eastern Catholic church. Over the last 2 centuries, its denominational ownership has been fraught, with at least 3 local Christian populations potentially laying claim to it. Further to this, the interior of the interior of the church also contained many objects and images that originated from outside of Poland. In 2011, the monastery at Ducatoriu in Mount Athos, and I've pronounced that terribly, sent a copy of their own icon of Gheorghe Ipicus. So this is the icon that it was originally copied from, the prototype for the weeping icon. It now sits in the church alongside silk scarves and icons from Russia, prayer books printed in Ukraine. More so than any Orthodox churches in the area, the Church of St. John the Apostle cannot escape the transnational character of Eastern Orthodox Christianity in Poland. Within the church, the story of the image's travel from Ukraine to Poland resonates as part of a larger story of connections between different Eastern Orthodox congregations across the borderland, while also speaking of the embedded nature of Eastern Orthodox Christianity in the region. The weeping icon is drawn into a series of international exchanges and national negotiations. The icon's tears enable the local Orthodox community to stake a claim to belonging in this part of Poland through participation in this kind of miraculous Marianological landscape, and also draw the community closer to Greek, Ukrainian and Belarusian churches through her multi-ethnic connections. The image was also subject to transformations beyond the church, however, particularly in the local news. Once local newspapers and cable networks were made aware of the weeping, the miraculous image transformed from an image that represented the complicated relationships of national and international belonging to that the icon was used to emphasize, and instead it became a discussion about the exoticness of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. The story told in the local news set aside any emphasis on ordinariness. It stressed instead that the icon was an image from Ukraine, bought by a parish priest. In this storytelling, the grandmother disappears totally, and instead it's the priest who buys it, as a present for Łukasz. The news also made a great deal of a story going around that many pilgrims had also detected traces of oil on the bodies of other icons once the miraculous icon moved into the church. And there's this idea of contagion here in this that I think is kind of important to how often the Eastern Orthodox community is presented in this area as a kind of Slavic contagion as well. It's stressed, the news also made, importantly, the news emphasised that this Eastern Orthodox Church of Poland had decided not to test the miracle. This point failed to take account of how the Eastern Orthodox Christian clergy approached miraculous objects differently to Roman Catholic clergy. Some newspaper columns, interestingly, discussed the increase in pilgrims the church had received and noted that many of these were coming from Belarus, Ukraine, and Lithuania. So there's a lot of kind of dog whistles going on here underneath the local news coverage. Considering this discourse, which implicitly linked local Eastern Orthodox congregations to non-Polish churches, the parish has become wary of discussing the image. By the time I visited in 2011, Łukasz and his family no longer spoke to anyone without first consulting the priest. And I have gone back once since and could not get access to the family at all this time. It's all discussed through the church now. Alongside this, the appearance of the image in the local media actually transformed the icon's appearance. A new version of the image began to circulate, and this is a version that began to circulate. And it had become almost as ubiquitous as the original. The photographs the priest had taken of the weeping icon had initially been kept purely for record. However, the icon doesn't cry on demand or on schedule, so when the newspapers asked for an image to print, the photographs were dug out. One photograph in particular has come to stand for the original image. It's cropped. You can see that it's cropped so that, in fact, you can't really see the ornate framing of the image. It's very unclear what's going on. It just becomes kind of a head and shoulders portrait rather than the whole body. But importantly, you can see in this image the tears clearly streaming down the face of the Mother of God. These photographs of the miraculous icon were treated with care by the parish priest. They were stored in plastic jackets and kept out of the light in a binder in his office. And when I visited, I was given permission to photograph them, but only if I was supervised. In that moment, waiting camera in hand, while the priest's wife carefully extracted the images from their binder and laid them on the table gently, I was struck by the strangeness of the practice of producing copies of copies of copies of an original image, itself a reproduction. But in some ways, these photographs aren't actually copies. When I asked my friends outside his pedestal to describe the icon of the Weeping Mother of God, they combined this particular newspaper photograph with the original icon in their descriptions. Only few of the people I'd spoken with had actually seen the icon weep, yet when asked, the majority of them described the tears streaming down her cheeks. If pressed or asked to describe in more detail, some would even forget that the image had a background or remember it only as a portrait from the shoulders up. This new kind of hybrid image was an aesthetic formation most people I spoke with imagined when they thought about the weeping icon. And Brigitte Meyer has explained aesthetic formations as the incorporation of fixed images into our personal imaginations. So this is a really good example of an image that lives across the reality and the imagined, and how what we actually picture when we picture particular things are our own internal perspectives linked with the actual originals. This incorporation can lead to a tension between the images we perceive and the images we own. Our bodies can make us perceive, project, and remember images, but also enable imaginations that censor or transform them. Photographs of the initial miraculous act of transformation were circulated widely, and these photographs in turn transformed the weeping icon, as observers of the original icon began to incorporate tears and the emotive power of those tears into their memory of the icon. And the final transformation I wanted to discuss, this by the way is the original icon, is Pamiątki. The persistence of this particular new image was particularly intriguing after the initial media interest. It was rarely reproduced. The most common ways in which images of the Weeping Madonna circulated were as pamiątki. Pamiątki from Telespol, however, were not in fact reproductions of its weeping icon, but were reproductions of the original icon from Mount Athos. And despite the fact that they do have a striking resemblance, people were very quick to point out that they actually did not resemble the icon at all. But they could resemble the icon if they underwent a transformation. They had to undergo their own transformation in order to represent the weeping icon, and this transformation depended on proximity. When the pilgrims pressed these mass-reproduced pamiątki to the glass image of the weeping icon, in these moments of kind of heightened emotion, this act encouraged transformation, and the closeness of the two images and the experience of the power of the miraculous icon transformed these images into actual pamiątki. The miraculous event that most pilgrims experienced in their closeness to the icon had the power to transform the images they held, in other words. And this is the same power that explains the popularity of stories about the weeping spreading to other icons in the church. The idea that a miracle can transform all the objects it encounters. So I'm going to conclude very quickly, very aware that I've definitely gone over time. So when my interlocutors spoke about the miracle, they spoke about it through all its various forms that the image took. Replica of the icon on its own right, photographs, newspaper images, pamiątki, their own memories. These were not multiple different images to the people I just spoke with, but facets of a singular, miraculous image. In the first moment when the cardboard began to weep, and in smaller moments of change, like when devotees pressed their own pamiątki to the glass cases and they became charged, the miraculous image was encountered. When devotees spoke of the miraculous image, they were not referencing simply the physically present icon. The miraculous image was an event, that it was enabled by the experience of engaging with this ambiguous and dense materiality of the icon and its multiple reproductions. In this way, the miracle is an experience of wonder, but it is embedded in deeply ordinary material and practice. One of the affordances of these everyday materials is that the weeping icon is then able to participate in very quotient or ordinary local political practices. The image unites local dioceses, connects in Eastern Orthodox Christians to a landscape of Mariology that is part of the local placemaking practices, and highlights the complicated transnational connections of this religious community. This is why thinking of the object both as a religious object and an image is important. Mitchell has noted that images act beyond representation. They in fact instigate a series of social relations between themselves and the viewers. As more recent work on images has developed this idea further, we begin to see that these social relations are events that shape the world around them. By analysing the miracle of the weeping cardboard icon as an event that incorporates but is not limited to religious experience, the role the image plays in collective practices of placemaking becomes clear. Along the eastern borders of Poland, there is a long-standing Marianological landscape. Historic Roman Catholic images surrounded by gold and silver frames, crowned as queens and residing in monasteries, basilicas and ancient churches, have long been waypoints along this route. The Eastern Orthodox Christian weeping cardboard icon of Tiraspol is a contested addition to this landscape, yet it also invigorates the discussion around the role that these images of the Virgin Mary, Mother of God, have played in the political, practical, economic and social border work that has shaped this region. Thank you very much.